We'll get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third and I think our final one for 2020 policy forums here at the Garden State Initiative. I think we have a really interesting both subject as well as panelists who will be speaking with us in just a few minutes. And we're going to focus on the New Jersey Attorney General's office and actually how that can impact and does impact our economic policies. Just as stage setting for everyone, everyone right now is muted, and we will be taking Q&A actually throughout the forum today through the chat session. So please feel free as subjects come up, offer a question and we'll integrate it into the discussion. And I think we'll, have some interesting points that'll be made that will, cause you to want to learn a little bit more about some of these areas. But to set the stage for today's forum, we have with us the chair of the Garden State Initiative, Bob Eugen. Many of you know Bob as the retired executive chairman of Celgene, but he's, as also many of you know, born and raised in New Jersey, actually beginning in Hudson County. He spends most of his time now, though, really looking at and thinking and trying to help on how we improve the economic condition of the state of New Jersey, as well as other areas of the state. So we're very grateful to have Bob here this morning to set the stage for us. And after that, then I'll introduce our panelists and we'll get into more of the subject of the day. So with that, Bob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Regina, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Let me lay a little bit of the background on GSI, repetitive for some, but I apologize. I think it's important for us to do it just to level set. When GSI started, it really was a function of our concern that would there be a forum for discussing economic issues that are important to the long-term viability and success and quality of life for all New Jerseyans. After the Christie administration, would there be an opportunity to have a rational, nonpartisan, balanced, or bipartisan discussion of economic issues? And that has been the foundation of why GSI started. And I'm very proud to report that I think GSI is living up to that mandate of being nonpartisan, bipartisan, if there is a political component to it. And it's been really focused on research and education. It's a tax-exempt organization, so we're obligated to be nonpartisan and not involved from that perspective, but really provide that kind of rigor and foundation to ensure that more New Jerseyans, certainly policymakers and elected officials, have the education, the information to make rational decisions to lead to better economic outcomes for all New Jerseyans, to ensure that we have the kind of quality of life that allows us to keep our families together in New Jersey. Now, certainly this past year has been a challenge for all of us, and we've been affected in so many different ways. Obviously, COVID, the political turmoil, and not least, most importantly, by some of the social justice issues highlighted by the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor killings. GSI, like all of us, been affected by that, and I think have responsibility to react in a way to make sure that we're doing things that are consistent with the values that we embrace at GSI, and I think all of us on the call embrace. And I think we took it seriously, our responsibility to examine our framework, our analysis, to ensure that the policies that we're advocating for are rooted in good policies that affect all New Jerseyans in a fair and balanced way, and ensuring that we're providing guidance that is going to improve the economic benefit of all New Jerseyans, not just one select segment of the population. And we've seen that responsibility, and I think this is one of the programs as we're starting to make sure that we examine our work to ensure that it is designed to benefit all New Jerseyans in a fair way. But we've also seen that it's an opportunity for us to maybe attack some problems that have never been adequately addressed. When you look at New Jersey, that we have lack of equity in many different areas. And this is an opportunity to maybe shine the light of day on policies that have not contributed to the kind of outcomes for lower income New Jerseyans that some other segments of the socioeconomic ladder have achieved in New Jersey. And so we see it both as a responsibility to do the right thing, but also an opportunity to really maybe change the trajectory of how things are looked at. And when we think about the inequities in our society, we're very much focused on the fact that the root causes of these are poverty, not economic fairness and equity and opportunity, and education. And so we want to make sure that our analysis is, again, rooted in the philosophy and the principles that we have. We think those are applicable, but we've got to make sure that they apply, that all New Jerseyans and all socioeconomic part of the ladder have the same opportunity for their children and their families to stay together. So we hope that this is an ongoing discussion. Those, as Regina pointed out, this is our last one of this year, but we're hopeful to broaden these and make sure they're topics as you have ideas of things that we should be discussing to ensure that we have the kind of dialogue in our society that we should have. We appreciate that feedback and support. So thanks very much. Let me turn it right back to Regina and get the program started. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Bob. That was terrific. Us getting started. So I'll begin with, let's introduce our two guest speakers, panelists for this morning. First, the Honorable John Degnan, who served as Attorney General of New Jersey under Governor Byrne. John was actually the youngest Attorney General appointed in the state history, and he served as the Governor's Executive Secretary and Counsel prior to that as well. He later spent 20 years at Chubb Insurance, serving ultimately as Vice Chairman and Chief Operating Officer up until 2010. And then John and I had the opportunity to work together when Governor Christie appointed John chairman of the Board of Commissioners of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. He later served as president and CEO of the American Insurance Association, and General Degnan has earned his JD degree from Harvard Law School. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Regina.
Now, the Honorable Christopher Porrino, General Porrino and I had an opportunity to work together actually in several of his roles when he was in various positions in government in New Jersey. He first was the Division of Law, Director of the Division of Law from 2012 to 2014. He served as Chief Counsel for Governor Christie from 14 to 15, and then as Attorney General for the state of New Jersey from 16 to 18. He's currently a partner at Lowenstein Sandler and chair of the firm's litigation department, graduated from Lehigh University and received his JD from Seton Hall University School of Law. And Chris and I had a chance to work when he was leading law as well as the chief counsel. So welcome this morning, Chris.
Good to be reunited with you, Regina, and John, even if only briefly today.
Yes, yeah, we all three of us got to work when John was leading the Port Authority, so it's great. So thank you. Very grateful for both of you joining us here today. So we thought that maybe a good way to start off, and John Degnan's going to begin, and then Chris will add in, is there are unique characteristics actually about the Attorney General office here in the state of New Jersey. So just to talk about a few of those to set the context for the other subjects we'll talk about throughout this morning. So John, I'll turn it over to you and let you begin with that context for us.
Sure. I'll try to be brief. Most of you know, I think, that the state constitution was last revised in 1947, clearly the peak of executive power in the United States after the Roosevelt terms. And it's reflected throughout the Constitution and the power of the governor. But I want to talk today for a few minutes about the power of the Attorney General. So unlike, at least in my day, 44 states elected their Attorney General, New Jersey was one of 6 who appoints them. Once the Attorney General is appointed, he or she serves unless impeached, similar to the Secretary of State. Those are the only 2 cabinet officers that enjoy that level of independence once appointed, which is something I wish the federal government would emulate. Secondly, a lot of people don't know this, but there's actually a statute in New Jersey that binds every agency of the state to follow the legal advice rendered by the Attorney General. Unlike the federal system, where each department has its own lawyers and gets independent legal advice, in New Jersey, the Attorney General really is the sole authoritative voice of legal issues governing the way in which a department is managed or its policies are implemented. And then what I found, and I think Chris will echo this or not, is that given that level of power, there's a kind of an institutional bias toward the Attorney General in disputes among cabinet officers. So, for example, once in my experience, a highly politicized issue, funding for therapeutic abortions, came up. Ann Klein, a great lady who was the head of the Department of Human Services, didn't want to touch it. She was already getting ready to run for governor again. And so she deferred to the Attorney General for my legal advice on that issue, which anybody who either gives or solicits legal advice knows there, in my experience, there are rarely black and white answers. There are ways to interpret the law to follow a particular policy bent, and attorneys general do that. Let's be honest about it. But by deferring to the Attorney General to avoid a political downside, it gives the Attorney General an enormous amount of ability to influence policymaking in the administration. The last 2 points I would make is, if, as Chris and I both did, you have as Attorney General a good relationship with the governor, any cabinet officer who's inclined not to agree with your advice, notwithstanding the statute, knows that the governor is the ultimate arbiter and the Attorney General is going to win. So those fights rarely get raised because nobody wants to lose a fight before the governor. The last thing, and I think this is significant for the discussion today, is given Bob's introduction and the reference to the Floyd murder, the Criminal Justice Act of 1970 gives the Attorney General extraordinary authority over criminal justice throughout the state. While the 21 state county prosecutors are appointed by the governor, they're effectively subordinate to the Attorney General. And so are police departments, sheriff's departments, and virtually every other law enforcement agency in the state. The state police directly report to the Attorney General. So there's an ability on the part of the Attorney General, if he or she is proactive, to address the kind of social injustice issues that are dominant in the discussion of criminal justice these days, issues like community policing. And so, I'm hopeful that we'll see the exercise of that power by the current Attorney General to standardize and enforce a criminal justice reform that deals specifically with policing. So at this point, Regina, back to you.
Okay. Chris, did you want to add any comments on that?
Yeah, look, I think you covered the landscape really well, John, and I'm glad you didn't give me that speech before my confirmation hearing, because I would have been really nervous thinking about truly the breadth of the power and the authority. I say this, people ask me, what was one of the greatest, or what was the greatest thing about being Attorney General of New Jersey? And the truth is that it's the only time, I suspect, in my professional career where I'll have the absolute last word. On the criminal side in particular, there is nowhere else to go. There is no appeal right. You don't get to go to the United States Attorney General. The governor's not involved in the criminal aspect of the office's work. And you are truly the last word about whether a case is going to be made or whether you're going to utilize your discretion to pass on a criminal prosecution. And, when I was AG in the election, I guess it was, of course, the last election, the issue came up, and one of the candidates had raised the point that perhaps we should elect and not appoint the Attorney General in New Jersey. And the simple answer to that is, that'll be a decision maybe one day that the citizenry makes. But the whole construct of the office, the broad powers that John described, are inconsistent with an elected Attorney General. You could never go out and raise money. You have authority over every county prosecutor, all 21 of them. How could you possibly vet conflicts and decide who you could raise money from or not? And with that kind of broad authority, you really don't want someone thinking about, how votes are going to be cast for him or for her. And I think the other great thing about being Attorney General in New Jersey is not having to worry about that, about just, who's going to vote for you, who's going to like you, who's going to love the decision you make or not. The ability to do what you think is right is an incredible privilege. And, it was I I really did love almost every minute of it.
Terrific. Thanks. Thanks. Great context. So maybe just a way to be both timely as well as kind of, bridge off of some of the authority you were just talking about is, and it's timely because we're having restrictions and in the context of COVID, right? And what's going on in the state and the impact both economically, obviously, and, legally that that's having. I thought maybe we just begin with a broad, question to both of you. Maybe John, I'll let you start about Governor Murphy has issued a whole series of executive orders, and there's been some back and forth with the legislature, but several people have taken the administration to court, as has occurred in other states. And it's really been, I thought, to the credit of the current administration that with all the executive orders that have been issued and challenged, that they have had none really overturned by the courts. Whereas that's occurred actually in several of the states, most closely in Pennsylvania. Governor Wolf had some orders overturned. So you could talk about, the executive orders and, really the sturdiness in New Jersey that has prevailed, and anything you want to comment about, that from Attorney General's perspective.
Yes, and that's an interesting subject. During the Byrne administration, when the Republicans were in control of the Assembly, we developed a policy called benign neglect with respect to the legislature. And Byrne, I think, was one of the governors who began this tendency toward using executive orders in a very robust fashion to affect public policy. But it worries me. Executive orders, as we're about to see when Biden becomes president, thankfully, in my judgment, can be undone by this mere stroke of a pen. It's confusing to the public to see what they perceive to be, an enforceable policy of the government as articulated by the president or the governor in an executive order, simply undone by one person. On the other hand, there are cases such as COVID, I think, where in a robust use of executive order is justified given the urgency and imminence of the danger threatened. Where I think Governor Murphy gets credit is in building a base of public understanding and perception of the danger. I mean, in contrast to the president, he's been blunt, candid, and direct without being unduly alarmist about the threats that we all face. And I think it works better where there's a fertile public field for an executive order. They understand why it's being issued. They're less likely to oppose it. The last point I would make is New Jersey courts have, generally the state courts, had for decades a strong bias toward enforcing administrative agency actions and gubernatorial actions as well, as reflected in executive orders. And I think that helps this climate. We also have a federal judiciary, and Chris could speak to this more contemporaneously than I can, that's loath to interfere with state court determinations.
So I agree with all that. I think, one of the things that doesn't come up all that often, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds on the legal issues, but there is this thing, and I know Regina knows it well, called the Disaster Control Act in New Jersey. And it gives the governor, combined with another law called the Emergency Health Powers Act, incredible authority and discretion in the context of an emergency. The Christie administration used it often, but when you think about probably the most obvious use of it, and when considering the breadth of it and understanding the breadth of it, is post Sandy, we used the authority in the Disaster Control Act for the next 5 years in order to take the easements we needed to take to build the dunes up and down the Jersey Shore. And there were dozens and dozens of challenges made to the use and the exercise of that authority. I think we batted 1,000 or nearly 1,000, certainly on the ones that mattered. So here, in the context of a real health crisis that we're still in the middle of, the Disaster Control Act gives the governor, it's not unlimited authority, but I'm not aware, and there may have been a case or two, I think there's one at least, where the governor's authority under the Disaster Control Act has been successfully challenged. So it's not easy to begin with. And here in the context of this pandemic, number one, we've got a real crisis. Number two, the decision-making going on in the governor's office is, of course, I think they're doing their best to base it off of the facts as they know them and the science that exists. But the truth of the matter is that the determinations that are being made about, how many people should gather and what time restaurants should close and whether gyms are safe or not, so much of this is art as opposed to science. And that falls within that broad discretion that the governor is going to be allowed to have under the Disaster Control Act. And so you've got 90 or so executive orders that have been passed in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And not one of them has been overturned. And there have been lots of challenges. And I suspect they will continue to bat 1,000. And I do think they've done a nice job. I think they've been careful, and I think they've been reasonably measured, even if you disagree with certain of the policies. I do think they have acted within the broad discretion that the governor has. Look, John's concern is a real one about the unilateral authority of an executive and the legislature being left to the sidelines to watch. That is a concern. I would say, though, that if we left, emergency reaction and action to the legislature, we'd all still be talking about it as opposed to doing anything. And we'll talk about some of that maybe later on in terms of where the legislature is or has been on, on some other issues like legalizing marijuana.
Regina, I have to just interject one comment question. I don't think this is so one-sided, and I think that I don't want to leave the impression that it is one-sided. So one-sided in terms of the COVID response by the governor. I think that in many things he's done very well, and I think it is a serious issue, but it is a very diverse state. And when you have an executive making these kinds of decisions that are unilaterally imposed across the state, I don't think you have the same kind of granularity that the legislature brings to these issues. And I don't think he has done right by all different parts of the state. In fact, I think there's legitimate argument that the consequences of some of the lockdown after the first month, when we understood the biology of the virus, are going to cause more significant long-term health problems than the virus itself. So I think that, though I think many things have been done well, and I'm not here to overly criticize the governor at all about it. I think a lot of good things have been done, but there are consequences of executive action that prevent the kind of public debate about this issue when it's legislative action, that people are responsible to different parts of the state and different demographics. So I think on the margin is probably everything is more to the right side of the correct side of things than not, but it's not so positive, universally acceptable. It's all good.
Bob, Regina, if I could, I think Bob's point is well taken. One point I would make, though, Bob, is that decisions by a governor get made in real time, not with the benefit of what we've learned about this virus subsequently. So I think it's a fair argument that maybe he and we overreacted initially with the degree and magnitude of the shutdown. But as you call the biology of the virus has become known, it seems to me the orders have been more surgically applied rather than generically applied. And that's to his credit. I mean, I just to tell one vignette about the Byrne administration, I remember when 3 Mile Island erupted and the governor was told that Pennsylvania was going to issue an evacuation order for the city of Philadelphia. He turned to the state police superintendent and said, "Clint, what are the protocols for evacuating New Jersey?" The superintendent said, "None." He sent me out, I was then counsel, to draft an executive order nationalizing our drug companies to seize their supplies of potassium iodide so we could administer it equitably throughout the state. That was a real-time decision, which thank God we never had to implement, but it brought home to me in a way that I think we need to bear in mind here, that those decisions get made on the basis of facts that you know then, not what you learn a few days later.
No, I understand, but I think we have to make sure that people don't come to expect the governor to have the role, and not, I mean, the governor of Jersey, but executive orders to have such influence without the kind of oversight and involvement of a broader perspective of the legislature over time.
Yeah, and I think, Bob, your point is well taken in the sense that, as I've tried to describe, his decisions are going to be very difficult to challenge in this context, right? So it's not like you can disagree and say you can disagree all you want, and many of us do and have at times. But if you don't like the fact that restaurants are shutting down at 10 o'clock, we can talk about that, and we can lobby our elected officials to do something different. My point is that when you go to court, you're going to lose. And, I'm not in the business of turning away work, but I have turned away several groups who have come to me and asked, would I make the challenge? Because, I'm really not in the business of, I lose all the time, but I like to not think I'm going to absolutely lose before we get started. And so the authority is broad and deep. And the other thing, back to John's points about the breadth and the power of the AG's office, the other advantage that you have in New Jersey in a situation like this is the ability to have one attorney general who has authority over all law enforcement across the spectrum. And so you're able to enforce, uniformly, which may be good, may not be good, these executive orders statewide through the attorney general's authority down and into the county prosecutors. I won't regale you or bore you with stories from, our dealing with the Ebola crisis that never really became a crisis in New Jersey. But we were gearing up and making decisions literally on the fly about what we were going to do if we ended up with 200 or 500 people on a couple of planes that needed to be quarantined. And I can tell you, it wasn't going to be pretty, as we learned, the hard way from that nurse we quarantined in Newark, who ended up being, I think a whole Saturday Night Live episode. But it is a real challenge, and I think so far legally they've done a pretty good job.
Yeah, and actually, Chris, your last remarks about the breadth of the law enforcement, I'm going to bridge into cannabis in a second because I think it relates to that. But before we leave this subject, we had a specific question from Tony Ciccatello about the executive orders. Are they actually drafted by the Attorney General, or are they drafted in the counsel's office and then just defended by the AG? Can you just distinguish that for us quickly?
Chris, you go ahead and then I'll get in.
Sorry, I was tending to my dog who was distracting everybody. So the executive orders, if I heard your question, Regina, are prepared inside the governor's office. The AG's office will often have input if the governor's office decides it wants it. But the governor's office is really in charge of putting those documents together and formulating the strategy and the policy around them. When it comes to enforcement, there are really two mechanisms, both run out of the authority of the Attorney General. One is on the criminal enforcement side. A number of individuals have been prosecuted for disorderly persons offenses and other similar offenses. And on the civil side, you saw the gentleman with the gym in South Jersey be subject to a number of lawsuits, and one of our former colleagues, now a judge, holding him in contempt for continuing to open in violation of those, first the executive order and then the local orders of the municipal health department. So for preparation, policy, and conception, governor's office, and enforcement out of the AG's office.
Yeah, Tony's asked a great question. My experience echoes Chris. The governor's council writes the executive order. and promulgates it, the governor promulgates it, but the attorney general is going to have to defend it. So no responsible counsel to the governor in a controversial executive order is going to fail to secure the attorney general's sort of informal imprimatur, because of the embarrassment that would follow if an attorney general decided, as he or she could, that this was an executive order that exceeded the governor's authority, and it wouldn't be defended by the attorney general, and some independent outside counsel would have to be appointed to do it. I can't think of a precedent like that.
Good. Okay, thanks. Thanks for the clarification. Thanks for the question, Tony. So not short on controversy always in New Jersey. So in the last ballot, the legalization of recreational cannabis was passed by the voters. And I thought it might be helpful for the audience, and Chris, maybe we'll start with you this time, to kind of talk about now the challenge for the Attorney General with both the criminal justice reforms that have been going on and some of the issues associated with some of the actual legislative actions that have been not proceeding as quickly as some people would like. So the criminal justice, as well as law enforcement responsibility the AG has, and how he, has to balance those, and how you think about it. So Chris, if you'd start on that, that would be helpful.
Sure. In thinking about this subject this morning, I went back to look at some remarks that I had prepared in 2017 that I did give to a large group of law enforcement, and it's amazing. Other than the passage of the constitutional amendment as part of this year's election, really very little has changed in terms of advancing the cause of those who wish to make marijuana legal recreationally. Law enforcement almost universally does not like marijuana, right? Pretty much every police officer you come across is not in favor of recreational marijuana being legalized. It's just not what law enforcement is used to. But as I told them in 2017, marijuana would be legalized recreationally in New Jersey. The only question was when. Now, with it having passed by popular vote, the legislature still needs to act. We still need laws in order to implement how marijuana is going to be cultivated, distributed, and sold. And that battle is going on as we speak in the legislature. I think it was last Thursday, Senate committee voted a legalization bill out of committee. It's passed the full Senate. It decriminalizes possession of up to 6 ounces of marijuana. And then, just because, I guess, they figured they'd throw in, it also lowers the penalties for possession of psychedelic mushrooms. Right? See, it's head shaking. You're like, okay, we're going to bite off the marijuana piece, which is complicated and difficult and big enough. Let's throw in mushrooms while we're at it. And I haven't had conversations with folks who are in the middle of this to find out what's going on. I can only imagine that, this is as a result of certain members of the legislature not wanting to give this, victory to the governor just yet, because there are a number of people now in the assembly who are unhappy about the mushroom part of this bill. So it's just that, the dysfunction in Trenton continues. But law enforcement, I think, has slowly gotten its head around the concept. I think that there is still a ton of work to be done. When it's illegal to drive while you're high. The standard, though, to figure out when you're too high to drive really doesn't exist. It's a very amorphous standard. It's not like you can go take a blood test. And so you need these drug recognition experts literally in every municipality to be able to assess whether someone is high. And it's not like, and I think this is a significant point, one that is lost on many of the folks who are in the process of passing this legislation. It's not like it was, 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago, where, police officers would roll up on a car and, the smoke would be pouring out of the windows and you could smell it for a week. The delivery mechanisms now for cannabis are largely odorless and largely smokeless. The delivery mechanism is effectively like vaping. And so it's very hard to detect. You can't smell it. And so from a law enforcement perspective, in terms of enforcing the rules of the road, it's a real challenge. The other thing that worries me, and it worries me more even now than when I was AG, is I've gotten a little bit more focused on the as I've gotten into the representing some of these folks here and there. The delivery mechanism is a real concern. Kids obviously will continue to be illegal, just like alcohol, for folks who are under 21. But the ability of children to do this without detection is, to me, a little scary. And so I think one of the things that law enforcement needs to be considering, and parents need to be considering, and legislators need to be considering, is how careful are we going to be with respect to our children? It is a scary undertaking. It's not like alcohol. If someone's drinking alcohol in the middle of the day, you can smell it and you know it. Not so with the way marijuana is now delivered for most applications. So just in terms of the current status for everybody's information, as far as I saw last night, legislation is still in the assembly. Questions about taxation are still being discussed. Somewhere it looks like in the 6 to 7% range. And the issue of expungements and how we're going to deal with individuals who have convictions on their records for smoking small amounts of marijuana, people who have entered the criminal justice system for something that is no longer going to be illegal, is a real challenge and something that's got to be addressed. And so there's a current version of the bill that talks about quote unquote virtual expungements, which is kind of like a mass, we can deem it to not have occurred. But in order to really expunge the record, there is work that needs to be done in terms of removing the paper and removing from the computer files the records of these convictions. And that's still yet to be sorted out, surprisingly. And the legislature was talking about that in 2017, and it looks like they're still talking about it.
John, would you like to add to that?
Just maybe 1 or 2 points. I was an advocate of decriminalizing marijuana back in 1978. I don't believe that it's an appropriate function to ask law enforcement to deal with what is, in a broader context, a societal issue. And I think that's coming home to roost a bit with issues like the expungement of records. It's a little bit analogous, though, with a concern I have now, to the decision to legalize casino gaming and superimpose upon it the strictest form of regulation that existed at the time in New Jersey over any private industry. Over time and decades later, the zeal of the state to enforce the permissive law rigorously has declined. And it's reflected, I think, in a more lax regulatory environment for casinos than was intended when it initially passed. I worry about the same thing happening here, that over time, all the cautionary notes struck correctly by Chris in his narrative will give way to some degree or another to the interests of the industry itself. And that's just a concern I would have going forward.
Well, and it's just a good way to maybe bridge into this broader subject that, Bob was setting the context for in the beginning in terms of some of the economic inequalities and the, seeking for how do we create a more equal society economically in our GSI, kind of how we think about it. And really the AG's leadership role in that. And John, I don't know if you want to build on what you were just talking about a little bit, and then we'll go to Chris, in terms of how we think about social economic justice in the state, and, any thoughts you want to share with everyone.
Well, that's a big question, Regina, and I certainly don't have any prescription for dealing with it. And in my judgment, the root cause of economic and social injustice is income inequality, which in this country has gotten to the point where it contributes seriously to a feeling of disenfranchisement on the part of a whole significant part of our population. If you read Hillbilly Elegy, you get a feel for the hopelessness that a large part of our fellow Americans feel about the future. This is a critical issue. I think it may be the critical issue that we're facing. The Attorney General doesn't have an institutional mandate to involve himself or herself in that issue. But there are ways that I suspect those issues will come to the Attorney General's desk, and on which he may have to opine. But that probably summarizes my thoughts at the moment. I'll turn to Chris.
Yeah, so during our tenure, we dealt a lot with medical marijuana and the issues around it in the Attorney General's office. I stayed out of intentionally the debate regarding legalization generally. I didn't think, and I know it wasn't my place to be part of that debate. My job, as I viewed it then, was to enforce the law once the law was passed, to comment on the law if the legislature or the governor wanted me to or asked me to, but not to express policy views about whether I thought it should be legal or not. On the social justice side of it, I'll just note that the current proposed legislation doesn't allocate any money to the communities most seriously affected by these low level drug laws and offenses that have piled up on the community. So there's no allocation of dollars to the communities hardest hit. That's number one. Number two, there's still a provision that allows communities to opt out, and so you can sort of see how as I'm sitting here in Summit, New Jersey, I don't know what Summit has decided, but I could very easily see sort of that not here. And I think that complicates things a bit too socially. However, the bill does include a statewide delivery provision. So whether you can drive up the street or not, you can still, I don't know whether it's DoorDash or Uber Eats or whatever, probably be a little bit more regulated than that perhaps, but you will be able to have recreational marijuana delivered to your front door if the current bill passes.
And Chris, just for everybody to clarify, when you say opt out, you mean opting out of permitting the growing, production, and sale of recreational cannabis in their municipalities, correct?
Yeah, sorry, dispensaries. Yep, exactly, yeah. or growing. Yep.
Now, many towns actually passed, when this was being talked about over the last 2 years, many passed those kind of ordinances. What kind of effect do they have to be now reintroduced and passed again, or can they stand with the current laws that are coming forward?
My guess is that those expressions of, sort of not here will stand and will not need to be re-upped. But I don't know that for sure. But I think that the same concept that allowed municipalities to say we don't want a dispensary or a grow facility in our town will just carry over into the recreational side. And it's it creates some interesting challenges. The industry, and I'm no expert, but the demand for medical marijuana at the moment is supply is barely meeting it, right? So the New Jersey growers and sellers are having a hard time keeping up as it is. It's hard to imagine that, and it's going to take some time. Laws are going to have to get passed. There are all sorts of bureaucracy that'll have to be dealt with, and it'll probably take 6 months to a year before it's really online. But it takes, a lot longer than that to stand up a grow facility of significance. And so, I'm not really sure whether, the law of supply and demand is gonna work out here in a way that satiates the desire for recreational cannabis, especially where, towns can decide that they just don't want it grown or sold in their backyard.
Yeah, well, and as one final point to your point about demand, that, this was also discussed from a fiscal perspective for the state. And I think even in its most generous analysis, where the tax rates are, well into the double digits, it's still only, 200 to 250 million. I think it'll be closer to 100 million probably, in the end. So it's not really something that's going to, tip the scales in terms of the challenges that New Jersey has fiscally.
It's a rounding error, if that. And the notion that I remember, that being an argument, for legalization at the time, and I would say to myself, I guess, and maybe to my dog, that's a joke in terms of a reason. And I think we predicted that, sports betting would far exceed revenue from the sale of medical or recreational marijuana, and I think that's proven to be quite true.
Yeah. So Chris, maybe I'll just bridge a little bit off of this into the broader, subject about, as I asked John about some of the social as well as economic injustice and some of the unrest, frankly, again, other states have seen, but not really as prominent, here in New Jersey, or I should say frequent here in New Jersey. And so I don't know if there's anything you want to add from that perspective.
Well, look, I think I see Dr. Jefferson on this Zoom here, and he knows these issues better than I do for sure. But one of the things that I worried about, and maybe it was the thing that kept me up the most, was my fear for there being civil unrest in New Jersey, and civil unrest arising in particular out of law enforcement activity. And it was something that we worked very, very hard on trying to, support reforms to improve the trust between law enforcement and the communities law enforcement serves. And I think we made some strides, and we also had good and strong relationships with community leaders across the state. But at the end of the day, when I look at what's happened in the last 6 months, and I compare New York City and the city of Newark, because I think it's a good example for the point I'm going to try and make. In Newark, we had, for whatever you think of Mayor Baraka or his politics, you may agree with him, disagree with him. I'm not here to talk about that. What Mayor Baraka does better than almost any elected leader that I've witnessed is he is incredibly successful at walking that line between supporting law enforcement on the one hand and making cops feel like he's got their backs, and on the other, being deeply trusted by the community. And so in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, the mayor was able to go out and connect not only with the communities, which was the most important thing that he needed to do at that point. And I think in large respect, the community trusted what he had to say, but he was also able to draw on the trust that he had earned from law enforcement, because from when law enforcement feels that leadership is going to quickly toss them aside, or for whatever the circumstances are, lay blame at their feet, you end up with a law enforcement community that is not perhaps going to do the job that it needs to do in the way that it needs to be done. You have a law enforcement community that's way more nervous, and frayed nerves is not a good formula in situations like this because it increases the likelihood of violent and dangerous encounters. So I look at what happened in Newark, and I looked at the ability of strong leadership on the part of the mayor in this context to keep the peace. And then I look at New York City, and I look at what failed leadership, in my view, meant. The law enforcement community doesn't trust the mayor, and the communities in general, I think, don't trust the mayor. And so, it resulted in, I think, a very stark contrast between the two cities. And I'm proud of what Newark was able to do. And I hope that, one thing I always said about these events is that we need to maintain the sense of urgency to continue the reforms and not lose that sense of urgency as time passes. And I fear that as time passes, that, and the temperature drops, the desire and the initiative and the inertia behind getting things done starts to wane as well.
Yeah, Chris, thank you. And for everyone else. So Dr. Jefferson, David is on this call. And David, I don't know if you want to add anything. David and I, interestingly enough, know each other from former lives. We worked together at AT&T. Dr. Jefferson now leads one of the largest congregations in Newark. David, I don't know if you want to add to Chris.
Yeah, let me, first of all, thank you for having me on, Regina. And I have been listening. I think this is a very, very important forum. And obviously I picked up on a lot of things. Let me just kind of comment on what Chris was saying. I think that in a number of instances, law enforcement and the community cannot have episodic, event-driven kinds of relationships. I think that what Raz has done in Newark and what we have had in place is a continuing building of a foundation that kind of represent how the community and law enforcement should be working together. And so I think that there are some things institutionally that we continue to work on, because I think at any point in time, if we're not careful, things could explode. And so what is absolutely important is that over the years, and I've been there in Newark now, building a huge congregation and doing a ton of stuff in the community, is this whole notion of ensuring the fact that there is constant communication, that there is constant credibility, that there is constant, I would say, trust that is built across the board with a number of institutions. The faith-based community, for example, is something that Raz has a pretty good rapport with. And it's something that he's constantly talking to us about. And so, the church plays very, very, I think, strong importance in being able to have the community trust the church so that we can help support law enforcement. Now, there are times when law enforcement is not where we think they should be, and we bring them to the table and we attempt to work that out. The other thing that Raz did was he kind of walked with the people who were protesting. It was like, hey, we're going to work together on this. It's not like I'm on opposite ends of what you're thinking. And I think he also got law enforcement involved in the same thing. And so, at the end of the day, I think that McKinsey did a study for us with respect to the disparities that exist in the spaces of this, COVID, et cetera. And one of the things that they found was that the one institution in the community that has enormous influence when it comes to African Americans is the faith-based institutions. In a number of instances, they've lost trust and credibility when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to financial institutions, when it comes to government, you name it. But the institution, in fact, there's about an 87 to 90% level of trustworthiness and credibility that comes about as a result of that. And so I do believe that the work that had been done pre George Floyd, pre-Breonna, pre-whatever, helped to kind of manage that whole situation. And what I would say is that is a constant battle that we have to work on. If I take a look at New York, and Regina know I worked in New York for 10 years. In this instance, as I looked over the water, you know, the mayor had not built that foundation. And then when stuff broke loose, it automatically just exploded because he didn't have that rapport and he didn't have that kind of relationship.
Thanks. Thanks very much, David. I really,
Regina, Regina, I just want to maybe ask a question and add to it. I think it's very encouraging to hear, you know, the comments and the perspective on what's happened in Newark and hopefully cities in Jersey. And to me, the real opportunity is if you have that kind of situation where we're building better trust and some of the issues that are plaguing other cities aren't plaguing our cities, which is hopefully a big positive. How do we then convert this conversation to dealing with the root cause of the problems? I think, you know, police brutality is a horrible thing. We're all opposed to it. But what's causing these issues? And I certainly believe they are economic, lack of equity in education and fairness and economic opportunity. How do we move that conversation to have the openness and discussion so we can attack those specific issues? Is one of the things I hope that GSI can take on over the coming years.
I think, I think you're absolutely on the money. I think what we happen to have seen with respect to George Floyd, you know, George never had a permanent job. George never had health insurance. George never had an opportunity to experience the American dream, given some of the gaps and disparities that absolutely exist in our country. And the guy had gone from different places attempting to kind of have a life. And I do believe that we got to stop treating the symptoms and we need to start coming together to look at the root causes and what is absolutely driving this. I think that it is a sad state of affairs, even in our own state, when you know we have the average African-American family that is at $9,500. And the average Caucasian family is $172,000. I mean, there's no way in the world you can live on that. And there's no way in the world you can really survive under that scenario. And you know, I just got off a major thing yesterday where they have identified Newark and myself to lead a huge effort around this whole COVID thing. We formed a major partnership with Quest. And it's going to be announced and it's going to be on CBS, the whole 9 yards. And one of the things that I really think that we need to do, and I'm going to reach out to Corey and I'm going to reach out to Menendez, we got to get pharmaceuticals to really come to the table so that we can put some manufacturing facilities, put some capital into Newark, create some jobs into Newark in order to try and help start closing this gap. I think we got a real opportunity here. The question is whether or not we have the courage to bring leadership together in this state and see how it is that we have an abundant amount of resources. We just need to get people to the table so that we can address the root causes. And if I look at Newark, you know, God bless Newark. I love Newark. You know, pastor in Newark, the whole 9 yards. But at the end of the day, I just don't think that we have the appropriate foundation, economic foundation in Newark that would give my kids the hope that they need to have a career and a future and a family in the city. And I'm very glad that you brought that up because to me, that's something that GSI, I really hope that we can start discussing and addressing that kind of issue. You're absolutely on the money. That's the root cause. That's what gives rise to a lot of this.
Yeah, David, yeah, you and I have had conversations and, you know, I think Bob's pushing that is how do we have economic development in a city like Newark? And I think pharmaceuticals actually is going to provide some opportunity as well as I'm sure other industries, but that is the basis. And if we can at GSI, you know, start to, you know, make that more prominent and make that part of the agenda, the economic development agenda for the state. I mean, that is, I believe, as you say, you know, part of the root cause and the root solution that we can for the prosperity for the whole state.
Yeah,
Bob, do you want to make a comment, your closing comment?
So I'm sorry, just one last thing. I don't think we should exclude, and we need to have the political process and elected officials engaged in that issue. But I think we need to undertake a broader understanding in the general population of the economic issues and the fairness issues, but also the benefit to everybody else. It isn't a question of taking somebody from somebody else and giving it. The more we do in these underdeveloped areas where there hasn't been equal opportunity, we actually make it better for the areas that are doing well, not worse. And so we've got to do a better job of getting support in the communities. The politicians will follow where the people go, and we want to work with the elected officials, et cetera, but they're not going to solve it. The political divide we have and the partisanship and the issues we face and needing to be reelected and all that other stuff makes it very difficult for them to take on bold and courageous activities. I think to work with general business people, community work, community service people, but we need to educate people as to the benefits, the importance, the value of doing it. It's the right thing to do, but it's also in your interest to do it. And so we need to educate people. And that's one of the things I'm optimistic that GSI is going to be able to do more effectively as we go forward.
Good. Well, terrific. So we're due to close up here in about the next 10 minutes. I'm going to try to just add one more question that is a little bit more timely, not quite as broad-based as the conversation we're just having. But since we are coming to the point at which we're going to be certifying in New Jersey, we haven't yet certified our election. And a lot of places are still counting, as we know. Maybe just as a closing, question for both John and Chris about the AG's role now, in terms of election integrity, and any thoughts you want to add for the last couple minutes here. We'll try to finish up in the next 5 minutes. So John, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think, Regina, that question fits into the discussion we've just had in some ways. I think this takes it to a more philosophical level, but the faith that people have or need to have in government in order to accomplish what Bob and David just described depends on how they view government's ability to respond to their needs. If the Attorney General sits at the apex of the writ large justice system in the state, then he or she needs to act in a way that warrants that faith. A good contrast is what's going on at the federal government now with the politicization of the Justice Department and the apparent attempted use of the department to criminalize political behavior or to put their thumb on the outcome of a decision that ought to turn on the fair application of justice. So it's imperative that the Attorney General in New Jersey continue to model that behavior. And in terms of election integrity, as we discussed a little bit yesterday, I think for me, the best example of this now is when Jim Florio lost an election in 1981 to Tom Kean after 2 or 3 weeks of recount by a vote of about 1,300. I remember that election well because Florio beat me in the primary to get the right to lose to Kean. It was, and Governor Kean has spoken to this eloquently, it was the Attorney General's office, which was then controlled by my successor, Jim Zizali, who had to rule on a lot of the disputes that were coming up during the recount. Zizali wisely stepped aside and gave the role to a non-political appointment, a wonderful guy and a close friend of mine named Mike Cole, but a Democrat, at least nominally. And Kean spoke eloquently about his ability to defer to an Attorney General's office that he viewed as impartial and infused with integrity. And that should be the role of the Attorney General and the Justice Department in this election dispute. It worked then because Kean himself had faith in the department and he modeled it with all of his allies and told them to stand back and stand down and let the Attorney General's office make impartial rulings. And I hope, although it doesn't look like it's going to come to that here in New Jersey, that same kind of deference is both warranted and will be extended.
It's a great story, wonderful in terms of, as you say, how elections have been handled here previously and the role of the Attorney General. So very helpful. Thanks, John. And wonderful history for all of us. Chris, want to add to that?
Briefly, it's a great credit to the system. Maybe not perfect, but it works pretty well. The system that we have here in New Jersey and the setup of the Attorney General's office. I think, I saw a couple of elections while I was in the AG's office, and Republican or Democrat came to the Attorney General with issues and concerns, not fearing that we were going to be partisan. And I think that it's a credit to the way the system has been constructed, and it goes back to the point of, and there are some good things about having an elected Attorney General, but a friend of mine from Pennsylvania, the AG over there, Josh Shapiro, who I worked with and across while I was AG here in New Jersey, is of course elected. Very nice gentleman. But you may have seen, he tweeted, right? He has oversight of election integrity while votes were still being cast and before they all had been counted. He tweeted, if all the votes are added up in PA, Trump is going to lose. And he goes on and says a few other things. He says, now ignore the noise and go vote. Now, I can't even imagine an Attorney General here in New Jersey, no matter how political you might be, coming out and saying something like that publicly or even privately inside the office, because it's just not the way we've done it. And I think it's worked pretty well. And it's one of the things that I hope doesn't change going forward.
Terrific. Thank you. So I'm going to try to wrap up, and Bob, I'll let you make kind of the last word on the subject, but General Degnan and General Porrino, really appreciate, your perspective and historical perspective as well as going forward, because I think all these issues, as we've said, relate to the both economic as well as social system here in New Jersey, which GSI hopes to be able to help propel in a positive way. Dr. Jefferson, thank you for your contributions, and Tony for your questions. And with that, Bob, I'll turn it over to you for closing remarks.
Just thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And please take it seriously. Our request to identify areas that we should explore and bring more attention to and spotlight on these kinds of opportunities, but also in general for the research and educational work that GSI is going to do and will do. And so I hope everybody has a healthy and safe holiday season and enjoys it the best as possible under the difficult circumstances. But thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in 2021. Bye.